There's nothing like watching a great movie on the big screen with an audience the way it was meant to be seen. The energy in the room is infectious. At Cowtown Movie Classics, we partner with the finest institutions in North Texas to bring you the glamour and thrills of old Hollywood with the proper historical context. Each screening features an all-new discussion with a world-class film historian, artist, or special guest, hosted by me, Ryan Bijan. We believe it's important to recognize how the icons and images of yesteryear inspire the entertainment of today. Cowtown Movie Classics. We make the old new.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and I'm incredibly honored and excited to be presenting the second half of this double feature. From 1935, it's director James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein. Certainly one of the greatest horror films ever made, probably one of the greatest sequels ever made. It boasts a stellar cast. Returning from the original Frankenstein, of course, we have the amazing Boris Karloff as the monster. We have Colin Clive as Henry Frankenstein. And in two very different roles, we have Elsa Lanchester. Joining me now is a prolific film historian, screenwriter, and author. As a screenwriter, he certainly knows his universal horror, being the co-writer of Dracula, Dead and Loving It with the legendary Mel Brooks. It's an honor to be sitting here with Mr. Steve Haberman. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing good. I feel fortunate to be able to introduce this. I mean, Bride of Frankenstein is in the running for maybe the greatest horror film ever made. Certainly the greatest gothic horror film ever made. And you're going to see why shortly. This movie was made in 46 working days. It went $100,000 over budget when $100,000 was real money. The movie altogether was only $400,000. That's even going over budget. So, and it's James Whale's masterpiece, which is saying a lot. James Whale directed Frankenstein, The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and they gave him basically carte blanche to go crazy on this movie. And he did in terms of cinema, he did in terms of spectacle, he did in terms of perversity, and you're going to see it all. And he got some of the great performances also of all time, not just in the horror genre, but of all time. I mean, if they had any sense of value back in 1935, they certainly would have nominated, if not given the Oscar to Boris Karloff as the monster, because he's spectacular in it, as is Ernest Thesiger. He's equally spectacular in a supporting role. He's basically Mephistopheles to Colin Clive's Dr. Frankenstein's Faust. And he tempts him to do the wrong thing at every turn. He also tempts the monster to do the wrong thing at every turn. So he sort of stands in as the devil, if you want to look at this movie as an allegory. There are some of the great scenes of all time. I mean, my buddy Mel Brooks almost ruined this movie, which was not his intention, I'm sure, but the way he parodied the blind man scene, the way he parodied the bride, the way he parodied so many things in this movie. But you know what? You're not going to think about young Frankenstein when you're watching Bride of Frankenstein. That's how great this movie is. You're going to get lost in it within the first 5 minutes, and you are just going to be in James Whale's hands from then on, and you're going to go for this ride, because every scene is good, every scene is memorable, and it builds up to the greatest climax perhaps in any horror film. So I envy you if this is the first time you're watching this movie. And if this is the first time you're watching this movie, might want to ask yourself, why? Go get a life.
Well, no, I mean, I'm certainly, again, like you, I am envious of the audience members getting to see it for the first time on the big screen. But having just finished the original Frankenstein, which is a masterpiece in its own right, tonally, what are some of the differences between the two films, and what does the audience have to look forward to if they love the original?
Well, the biggest and most confusing difference between the two films is if you really look at Frankenstein, it's taking place in 1931. So, they have electric lights, they have, there's no automobiles or anything like that, but their mode of dress, especially the women, especially Elizabeth, May Clark's Elizabeth, it's pretty much 1931. It was contemporary because they didn't want to spend the money. But this movie is definitely in the 19th century. A recently deceased corpse toward the end of the movie has a death date of 1899. So let's say it's 1899. They look more like, it looks more like Regency era costumes to me, but it's Middle European, so who knows. But anyway, that's a big difference. The other difference is that the original Frankenstein is very grim and it's very straight faced. Every once in a while, there's a little comedy relief coming from Dwight Fry or others. Certainly, the Burgermeister and the Old Baron give you a little comedy relief. But in this movie, it's you don't want to say it's a satire and you don't want to say it's a parody, but what it is it's camp. It's deliberately camp. Now, what does camp mean? That means it's deliberately exaggerated. It's the acting is unnatural deliberately. It's not naturalistic. It's expressionistic, but in a theatrical way. So you're going to see a lot of exaggeration, which is very entertaining and occasionally in the hands of Una O'Connor annoying. But that was all intentional. And it gives the bigger than life gothic quality to this. You know, you can do that in literature just through language, but in movies, everything is bigger than life in Bride of Frankenstein. The gothic architecture, the music, you know, the performances, as I said, everything is bigger than life. And so the original Frankenstein, I think he wanted to make it feel like it was more naturalistic. It was more happening in a kind of contemporary time, but this is in a fairy tale gothic nightmare world that doesn't really hook up to the original Frankenstein, you know, exactly. And especially since, you know, uh, the when Frankenstein was released, it was like E.T. It was a tremendous hit and it was very, very powerful. And they decided that they would put a happy ending on it, a little coda at the end where the old Baron comes out and he says some things, you know, and it looks like Frankenstein's going to be okay. Forget about that because this movie starts as the windmill is burning to the ground, and we don't know if Frankenstein, you know, Baron Frankenstein, or I should say Dr. Frankenstein, is alive or dead as this movie begins. So they don't hook up exactly, you know, but they're companion pieces. I think if somebody put a gun to my head and said you can keep one, I would keep the Bride of Frankenstein.
And I would too. Without further ado, from 1935, The Bride of Frankenstein. To me, honestly, and I know you probably share the same opinion, it's Bride of Frankenstein and The Black Cat. To me, these are the two crown jewels of the Universal horror canon.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Um, yeah, the Bride of Frankenstein is the summit of Universal horror. It's I think it's the summit of horror in the 30s, and many people think it's the summit of Gothic horror entirely, and that's certainly arguable. You know, I'm in love with different eras of cinematic horror, and so you know I wouldn't want to I guess, you know, I again, if somebody put a gun to my head, I might say Bride of Frankenstein is the greatest horror, or at least gothic horror film ever made. But I would be wrestling with Mask of the Red Death and Horror of Dracula and The Innocents. You know, there's a lot.
It's a
Now,
broad genre. Even you say horror film, there's so many subgenres within that. You know,
yeah.
I know people have seen Bride of Frankenstein at time today. They say, "Oh, this movie is corny. It's cheesy. It's not scary." But to me, a horror film doesn't necessarily have to be scary. It's more about the ideas and the concepts.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know what cheesy means. I've struggled with that adjective a lot. And does
Right.
it cheap? Because this movie certainly doesn't look inexpensive.
Oh, certainly not. I mean, I think there's a certain, well, like you mentioned the camp element, and I think there's certain audiences who may not be in tune with that, and they think it's done. Like, obviously, James Whale, he's doing it ironically. He knows what he's doing. He has a sense of humor, but I think some audiences don't pick up on that. They think
Well,
it's trying to be scary. Yeah,
that shows more of a lack of sophistication with the audience than the filmmaker.
of course. Yeah, no, I agree.
James Whale was gay, of course, famously, and camp has been, you know, a part of, I think, the gay monde forever, and that was quite deliberate on his part. There's a certain misogyny in the movie, which I think goes along with homosexuality, with all apologies, of course, to my gay friends, but it's true. Una O'Connor always comes out badly in a James Whale movie. She looks terrible in all of them. As a matter of fact, Elizabeth becomes very hysterical in this movie. You know, the scene where she's seeing the figure like death in in the bedroom. You know, she's an hysterical, over emotional young bride.
Hmm.
And that's not a becoming quality, I think, in this day and age. But it was quite deliberate, I think, on the part of James Whale. So those elements, I don't know. I watched the movie last night in honor of you, of course, and I watched it with my wife, and she got really scared. You know, I mean, the monster kills a lot of people in the first 5 minutes of his story in this. A lot of innocent people die. And it's just, I mean, I'm sure the monster had his reasons, the fact that they tried to burn him alive, but still, it's a really brutal way to start a horror movie, especially a post-code horror movie. And and I think that, like the shower murder in Psycho, that violence and that brutality sort of shadows the rest of the movie. Now, the monster's never been more sympathetic or more human than in Bride of Frankenstein, but since he's introduced in the beginning at his most monstrous, you know, I can't think of any Frankenstein movie where that shows the monster more violent and sociopathic than the beginning of Bride of Frankenstein. I think that hangs over the whole thing. And my wife said, you know, she thought, and it's different also when you watch a movie alone. You know, we have a big like 92-inch screen and surround sound, so you watch. It's basically you've created your own theater, and you're watching the movie like that, and you don't really have other people to clue you in on their reactions to things. So you're reacting in your own way. And by the way, I prefer that. You know, a lot of people say, "Oh, I miss I don't miss movie theaters. I hate people. I don't want to watch movies with other people. What do they know?" And so I think if you watch Bride of Frankenstein alone or with a sympathetic audience, that those qualities of whatever you just said, cheesy and corny, it's
Sure.
it's too perverse to be corny. I mean, if
Hmm.
you're hip to what the movie is really talking about, it has very critical things to say about all authority. James Whale wasn't a fan of authority after being, you know, cannon fodder in World War One, and also being a gay man who sort of had to live secretly in those days. Um, he has no authority, obviously, for the Burgermeister, for government, for the police. They're all fools. The crowd, they're all easily manipulated fools. The church, you know, doesn't come out well in this movie. Although, arguably, the movie is a bit Christian. I think there's a certainly the you know, originally when the monster is running away from the mob in the graveyard in the fog at night, he was going to push over the cross with it was a crucifix with Jesus actually hanging on it, and he was going to push that over and reveal the pit that he goes down into, which is an underground tomb. And the censor said, we're not doing that. So you'll see Jesus in the background on his cross, and but what the monster pushes over is a bishop, is an
Hmm.
officer of the church, and that's more, I think, in keeping with Wales' kind of disdain for authority, and also,
Hmm.
you know, it keeps Jesus on his cross, you know, as Christians would prefer. So there is that, and also the blind man. You know, the movie is very hysterical and baroque, and then when the monster gets to the blind man's hut, it becomes very quiet. You know, he's playing Schubert's Ave Maria on the violin, and he comes in, and it becomes very touching and moving. These two outcasts, which is, you know, adapted freely from Mary Shelley, and when the monster is trusting enough to allow the blind man to lay him down to sleep, there's a crucifix on the wall and back. And as the scene fades out, uh, Whale keeps that as a matte shot that's still visible in the darkness after the picture has gone to black in the fade out. So, you know, there's a certain aspect of Christianity. He's not Terence Fisher, who like advertises his Christianity in every movie,
Hmm.
but there's a certain, I'd say, respect for that as a power in the universe, that is affecting this story, is affecting the characters. I mean, everything that Frankenstein doesn't want to do is because it's blasphemous, which Elizabeth is quick to remind him, and which Dr. Pretorius, who is his Mephistopheles, is quick to dismiss.
Hmm.
You know, he appeals to Frankenstein's pride and his ambition to create a mate, and in fact, a whole race. You know, he says, "Hey, how wonderful would that be? How wonderful would it be? Not too wonderful." But anyway,
Yeah.
he tempts him with that, and so there's a lot of work in this that keeps it from being A, cheesy, whatever that means, and B, corny, which corny is cliched, corny is predictable. I don't think, except that this movie is one of the most famous movies ever made in the last 100 years, I don't think there's anything predictable that happens in The Bride of Frankenstein.
I agree. I mean, I feel like it's a masterpiece. You mentioned the scene with O.P. Heggie as the blind man. That always breaks my heart. That always gets me in tears. So, it's a film that it's genuinely creepy. There's parts in it that are genuinely funny. And then I'm moved. So I'm feeling the whole spectrum of human emotion as I'm watching this film.
Yeah, what more could you ask for a movie? I used to tell my students that movies really only do. I used to ask them, what are you trying to do with your movie? What do you? Oh, I'm trying to turn them up to coalesce the vapors of the. I said, no, you're not. You're trying to do one or two or three things. You're trying to make them laugh. You're trying to make them cry, and you're trying to make them scream. If you do
Mhm.
one of those things really well, you'll have a hit. If you do two, you'll have a big hit. If you do three, you'll have made a classic. And that's what The Bride of Frankenstein does.
Absolutely. Now I'm curious, in this era of franchises, of cinematic universes, if you have a movie like Frankenstein and it's a huge hit, you're going to get three or four Frankensteins within the next 2 or 3 years. So let's go back in time. So from 1931, when the original film was released, it's almost 4 years before we get this film in theaters. And this is following, like you said, this is the height of that initial Universal horror cycle with movies like The Old Dark House, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, Werewolf of London. So why did it take so long for Universal to greenlight a direct sequel?
Well, I think that they wanted to strike gold in many different ways. They kind of created the horror film as a genre with Dracula and Frankenstein, and they immediately. Also, Carl Laemmle Sr., the old man, was not a big fan of the genre. Junior was. He the story is he liked scary stories from the time he was a baby, and they were told to him in his crib. But the old man thought they were in bad taste, which of course they are. Which that's one of the great things about them. But I think they said, well, we made a classic Dracula. It's a classic of horror, made a lot of money. We made another classic Frankenstein, made even more money. Let's keep doing that. So they had to look around and see what other class. Well, Murders in the Rue Morgue, that's Poe, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they tried that, and didn't it wasn't the hit that Dracula and Frankenstein were. And then they did The Mummy, which was, and they created that story. I mean, it's got antecedents from the works of Arthur Conan Doyle, but they're short stories, and they're not exactly like they have the same kind of subject matter, but they're not exactly the story of The Mummy. But that was a hit, and they just thought, well, let's just keep trying this and that. What are we going to do next? The Invisible Man, huge hit, classic, based on a literary classic like Dracula and Frankenstein. So I think, and also um, wisely, they went back to James Whale, who was responsible for a couple of those along the way, The Old Dark House and The Invisible Man. And it just, I mean, I think in those days, there wasn't this commercial imperative, to strike before they figure you out. They had
Mm-hmm.
created a genre, and now they were going to explore it. And not only them, but other studios. Warner Brothers made Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum, and Jack Warner was no fan of the genre at all. He didn't like it. But you had to do it, it had to be on your calendar because it was a money-making genre now. People wanted to see it. And Paramount did two literary classics, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Island of Lost Souls. And
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was taken so seriously it won the Academy Award for Best Actor.
And
Uh,
I would argue those two Paramount horror films are probably even better. Watching them today, I think they're stronger films than a lot of the Universal films of that era.
Oh yeah, they're up there. I don't think either one of them is as good as Bride of Frankenstein
Maybe not Bride of Frankenstein, but some of the other ones
or
I've
Black Cat. The Black
yeah,
Cat is a masterpiece because that
yeah.
is a truly personal work about a contemporary and yet universal subject, which is war and what
Hmm.
war does to its survivors. We know what it does to its victims, but sometimes it does even worse to its survivors. And
Right.
that is just a really brilliant movie, The Black Cat. Listen to my commentary. So they did that, and it became a genre. And I think it was time well spent those 4 years to get to The Bride of Frankenstein. And I think they knew, since Frankenstein was the biggest hit, that they had to top it. So they
Hmm.
spent money. $400,000 was a lot of money, and it was budgeted at less than $300,000. They let him go over $100,000 over budget. 46 days is a real healthy studio budget in those days because you never go on location. You're
Hmm.
in this sound stage and you're in that sound. You're in that set and you're in the set next door. You don't have to like pack up and get in a truck and go anywhere. So 46 days was a pretty healthy schedule for a studio made movie in those days. I mean, that movie is as big, if not bigger, than the big MGM movies of the time.
Right. And I mean, to me, it certainly shows on screen. Now, I've never read any of the shooting scripts or the surviving materials from the film, but I had always heard, and maybe you can clarify this, that the original cut was around 2 hours. You have Dwight Fry's character, Carl. He had a subplot where he's murdering villagers and blaming it on the monster. How true is any of this?
Well, it's true. It wasn't 2 hours, but it was maybe 10 minutes longer, maybe
Hmm.
5 minutes longer. You're right. There was a little subplot when the monster is, he's put in prison, and then he breaks out and he's killing people left and right. And Dwight Fry's character murdered his uncle for money and blamed it on the monster. And then also the monster came up behind the Burgermeister as he's sitting in his desk, and there's an open window behind him and yanks him out of the chair and kills him. So there were a couple things shown. They don't show that now. They just show Minnie running around finding bodies. So that was a little bit long, but the gypsy scene wasn't in it originally,
Hmm.
because that's how they bridged that gap of the stuff that they cut out. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to get away from your main characters um, when things get that intense. Stay with the monster or stay with Colin Clive. You don't want to like go off with who cares about Dwight Fry except
Hmm.
Dwight Fry's family. So that was everything they did was right. What they removed, which was negligible, was good.
Hmm.
One thing that they changed, and they always did that, in the Phantom of the Opera in 1925, they had a scene where um, the Persian and Raoul are down in the bowels of the Paris Opera, and this figure comes out of the dark,
Hmm.
and and you can still see from their side what they were going to do. That this figure comes out of the dark with a lantern, so his face is glowing, and he's doing this with a stick. And he walks past them, and they look down, and what he's doing is he's the rat herder. He's getting the rats out of, and there are a whole swarm of rats. Well, they found that audiences did not respond well to rats in
Hmm.
1925. So they cut the shot of the rats out. They changed the title card, and they said, well, he's a spirit from beyond. He's warning us not to go on. It's some nonsense. But anyway, they kept it in because it's a creepy moment. And they even looked down, but they cut their point of view of the rats. Then
Right.
in Dracula, they said no rats in Castle Dracula. People don't like them because people back then, many people were rural and they lived in the countryside, and rats are vermin, and they were tasteless. They were in bad taste, not like sucking people's blood. And
So
so
instead, we had armadillos instead, right? Is that
exactly. So they substituted armadillos and opossums and spiders. That was okay. And in this movie, in Bride of Frankenstein, when he throws Maria's mother down into the pit and she dies, they were going to cut to a rat watching. And they removed that shot and they put the owl in.
which the owl I think kind of makes more sense, right? Like, what would a rat be doing down there in the? I don't know, but
Well,
it works for me.
yeah, exactly. Well, but the point is, there was a boundary of taste that they wouldn't cross.
Right. So, when of course, this is one of my all-time favorite movies now, but when I was a kid, I remember being very disappointed because the title of the film, it is Bride of Frankenstein. I had the MCA Universal VHS with Elsa Lanchester featured very prominently. And then I watched the film and I'm like, wait a second, she's only there for 3 minutes at the climax of the film. But going back and rewatching it, I think she's quite underrated as not only the bride, but Mary Shelley in the beginning. She's very memorable.
Well, yeah, there's even a shot, where Mary Shelley pricks her finger and she stands up and Shelley goes over and grabs her hand and both her hands are outstretched and Byron comes over and takes her other. There's a shot that exactly mirrors that with Frankenstein as Shelley and Pretorius as Byron, and she's Mary Shelley. Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, I don't think time on the screen really matters. It's how the bride is used, and she's used so brilliantly and ironically. I mean, she's
Mhm.
created as a mate for the monster, but she's terrified of him like everybody else. And it
Yeah.
just makes the monster more alone. And the creation scene is one of, if not the greatest scene in horror history, one of them certainly, up there with the shower murder and Psycho. And and as I said, the irony of the monster, being rejected even by this creature that was made for him, and the parallels, of course, with, as you said, the prologue with Mary Shelley. It's brilliant. I mean, how could you use The Bride any better than that? If you've ever seen The Bride, the movie The Bride,
Hmm.
the whole feature is about the bride and what happens after the creation. Not that interesting.
Right.
They did their best, but really, what are you going to do with that? She became a proto-feminist. Do we really need, a political statement using The Bride of Frankenstein? I don't think so.
Right. But, even then, like you said, the screen time is not necessarily an indicator of how the quality of use, I
It's
feel.
not even quite, it's the impact of that. I
Right.
mean, the design of her, the Nefertiti hair and the white shocks, and the shroud, and she's tall, and just Elsa Lanchester's face and the scars. I mean, you couldn't have more impact than that. If she were around longer in the story, that would lose impact. Or they might have to do something like what they did with Karloff and the Mummy, and like she somehow becomes socially acceptable. She can like interact with other characters, but
Yeah.
just using her for that, I think, is brilliant.
Right. And of course, that first Frankenstein movie, it's such a radical reinvention and reinterpretation of the Mary Shelley novel. There's very little of the literal action that we read in the novel, in the film. Of course, the character names are changed, everything's different. It's very much condensed and of its time. But I think one of the brilliant aspects of Bride of Frankenstein is that despite all that, James Whale returns to Mary Shelley's material to find those iconic scenes and moments that he didn't get to use in the first movie.
Well, I agree with you. I think that's the greatest value of Bride of Frankenstein, because that really is a much closer adaptation in terms of time period and what happens and the themes and stuff like that than the original Universal Frankenstein. Um, I think the great thing about the first original one is, first of all, Karloff. Uh, you collaborating with Jack Pierce, the look, the performance, the conception of that character is really, really brilliant and unforgettable. Obviously, it's made a huge impact on the culture, and we still talk about it. I think almost every change that they made to the story was not necessarily beneficial, but in a compacted, sort of stripped down version of the story, it worked. It works well. The production design is brilliant. So many things about it. The casting is brilliant. So many things about it work. Um, there's no reason it shouldn't be set in 1931. It's still magic to create life, and it's still magic now in 2024 to create. We can't do that. That's the greatest proof of God, is we can do everything, but once something's dead, it's dead. We
Mhm.
can't make something alive. We can't bring it back once it's dead. We can't create life from it. It's magic. It's absolute magic. And so, and yet it's very real for us. I mean, our sentience, our very conscience reminds us all the time that we are alive and that it's temporary and that it's not replaceable. You can't just change the battery. And so, I mean, that will be timeless. So you can always tell, I think, the Frankenstein story in any time period. However, if you're going to tell Frankenstein, I like putting it in the 19th century. You know, I like that. I love Curse of Frankenstein. I love the Hammer,
I agree.
the Hammer
Yeah.
Frankenstein universe. I think I'm more comfortable with that. And we visited that but once at Universal in Bride of Frankenstein.
Hmm. Well, you know what? That's a good segue to my next question. So, in the popular culture, right, if you look at these iconic monsters that were initially immortalized on film by Universal, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Phantom of the Opera, the Mummy, you name it, right, the Wolfman. It's so interesting to me that in 2024, if you were to ask a regular, like not a movie fan, but just a regular person on the street, okay, well, who is the Mummy, right? You know, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is the Stephen Sommers 1999 version of The Mummy with Brendan Fraser. If you ask anyone about Phantom of the Opera, oh, they think the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. Even Dracula or vampires, there have been so many various iterations. Everyone has their own idea of what a vampire is.
Does
But
anybody ever say Leslie Nielsen?
I do, but
Oh, good. Thank you.
but for some reason, with Frankenstein in particular, as you mentioned, there have been hundreds and hundreds of wonderful interpretations, adaptations, spin-offs. I'm a huge fan, like you, I'm a big fan of the Hammer franchise. I do enjoy the Kenneth Branagh film for what it is. But to this day, when you say Frankenstein, you think of Boris Karloff and the Jack Pierce makeup with the bolts. Why has this still remained sort of the dominant image of the character in popular culture?
Art. That's the reason, because it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those. I mean, you know, Jack Pierce had all of these rationalizations for why he did things. You know, he said, well, you know, he's trying different brains in, so he would make it, you know, easy to open the lid, you know, and so you'd have clamps and it would be flat on top. And, you know, and Karloff said, well, he was too aware, so I waxed the eyes and all those things. And you know, he made it big so that it would be easy to, but when you look at it, it's almost Art Deco. It's almost Art Nouveau. You know, it's of
Mm-hmm.
its time, and yet it's timeless. It's like the Mona Lisa. You know, it's of the Renaissance, and yet she's timeless. It's the
Mm-hmm.
expression, it's the background, it's the Rembrandt lighting, it's all of this stuff, and it's the same with the monster and Frank. And I disagree with you about Dracula. If you ask a kid to do Dracula, he does Bela Lugosi.
Oh, correct, right. But
Because
I do,
Bela
yeah.
Lugosi, that was art. That casting and Lugosi's expressionistic acting and all of that, somehow it just came together as something that can't be, it can be copied, but it can't be duplicated.
No,
And
I agree.
and I think that's why the monster, Jack Pierce and Karloff's monster, which is the greatest thing about the original 1931 Frankenstein, um, is indelible. Cheetah Rivera, the great dancer, they asked her one time what her favorite movie was, and you'd think, you know, uh, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, or Singing in the Rain, or some Bandwagon, or something. She said Frankenstein, and they said, Frankenstein, your favorite movie? You mean the Boris Karloff? Yes. She said his performance is like dance. It's like it's clumsy and yet it's graceful. You know, it seems random and yet it's very artful. It's extremely appropriate and yet it's set aside as a work of performance. And she was right. I mean, that performance is truly one of the great performances. Again, I think in 1931 they gave it to Frederick March for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Okay, arguably, you know, at least it's
Mhm.
a horror movie. It's the only Oscar we got until Silence of the Lambs for Best Actor. But Karloff probably deserved it more because that was a completely original thing from his imagination, and and he used his whole body. You know.
Now, I know people, or there's two different schools of thought on this subject, but you mentioned Karloff's amazing performance in the original film, which is a silent film performance essentially. But one of the great contributions from the Mary Shelley novel in the sequel is the monster talks. Where do you stand? Do you prefer his performance in the original, or does do you feel like the dialogue, does it dilute the character in any way, or does it add to the character?
I think it adds to the character. I think Karloff was wrong about that. He thought that that was a mistake. That it would it would be the end of the character, but it wasn't. It's unfortunate they didn't keep that quality, I think, in the sequels. I think the sequels might have been more interesting had they done that. But although I like the silent monster in Son of Frankenstein, he's scary. He's really frightening and powerful and just frightening. But I think it changed it. He's right, it changed it because in the original Frankenstein, even his makeup, you know, he's got the dark. First of all, he was thinner. His face is truly cadaverous. You could definitely see the skull, you know. And that James Whale said he originally envisioned the monster as a skull, a human skull on a huge body. And that's kind of what you get with Karloff. And also the dark circles under the eyes. He just looks dead. You know, he really does look cadaverous, and he acts like a just slightly reanimated zombie, you know, dead body. But in Bride of Frankenstein, he's a human, you know, he's much more human. He cries, he laughs, he drinks, he smokes, you know, he falls in love or crush. And we see his humanity as we don't. In the beginning of Bride of Frankenstein, he is the same kind of dangerous creature that he was in the original movie. You know, he kills Hans wife, he kills everybody around. Even a little girl, you know, who apparently just had her confirmation or something. All the other little girls are in white. But especially with the scene with the blind man, the monster becomes very human. And in the novel, of course, the monster is uber human. He's very articulate, and he doesn't have a criminal brain, and he just is a victim of neglect and of prejudice. And that's more what Bride of Frankenstein is doing. Frankenstein doesn't do it that much. You know, he is truly dangerous and unpredictable, and you know, like a psychopath in the original one. In the second one, he's dangerous because he's mistreated.
When you were working with Mel Brooks, did you ever ask him questions about, like, what about these classic Universal horror films like the Frankensteins or Dracula? What about those films appeal to him?
Well, I don't know that we talked about, we were together for many decades, Mel and I,
Yeah.
and we were friends, our friends. We've talked about everything, but in terms of that, he told me a story. He saw Frankenstein when he was little in Brooklyn, and they lived in a walk-up. You know, he'd lost his father when he was 3. He had brothers, and he had his mother, and he saw Frankenstein, scared him, and so he couldn't sleep, and he just couldn't sleep, and so his mother came in and said, "Melvin, what are you doing?" And he said, "I can't sleep, Ma. I saw Frankenstein, and I'm afraid Frankenstein's going to come in here and kill me." And she said, "No, Frankenstein lives in Europe, right?" "Yeah." "So for him to come here to kill you tonight, he would have to he'd have to get some food and pack up all of his stuff, and he'd have to get on a ship and go all the way across the Atlantic to Manhattan, right? He'd have to dock. He to find us here, he'd have to take a cab. He'd have to take a cab all in the streets, and we're up on the 3rd floor. He would have to walk up the fire the fire escape, to get to your window. And I don't think he's going to take that kind of trouble to get you." She says, "Oh, okay, Mom." So, cut to another time, I'm having lunch with Mel, and Mel is always good with civilians. People come up and they always say, "Oh, you know, I was having a hard time. My wife left me, and I saw Young Frankenstein or the Blazing Saddles, and you changed. Oh, thank you so much. I want to thank you." And he's, "Oh, well, okay, thank you. You have good taste." So we're eating. Mel has his sandwich, turkey on rye with a little Russian dressing. And I see behind Mel, a little old lady is walking up to him, old. And I think, this is trouble. And she comes up to the table, and I see there's numbers on her arm.
Hmm.
And Mel looks up, and he sees it's trouble. And remember, he's always good with civilians. And she says, "I just want to ask you one question." He says, "I'm having my lunch." She says, "Just one question. How can you make fun of Hitler?" And Mel says, he puts his sandwich down. He said, "I wasn't making fun of Hitler. Hitler scares me. Hitler makes my heart skip. And the only way I can deal with that fear is to mock him. That's the only way I can deal with it, is to make him smaller than he is in my consciousness. And that's why I made The Producers." And she looks at him and she says, "I just want to know how you can make fun of Hitler." And she walks away. Well, I put two and two together in my head and I said, "Is that why you made Young Frankenstein? Because you were afraid of the monster?" He goes, "Yes, that's very good, Steve. Yes, that's exactly why I made that, because he scared me too. Are you going to eat that? Because I," and that I think is the key to why he made Young Frankenstein.
Before we wind this up, what are you working on right now? I understand you have a book that's coming out or it just came out.
Yeah, I have a book that just came out. It's called Gothic for Radicals. It's kind of the user-friendly version of my PhD thesis, and it's about the collaboration of Gordon Hessler, director, and Christopher Wicking, screenwriter, on 4 Gothic horror films for American International Pictures: The Oblong Box, Scream and Scream Again, Cry of the Banshee, and Murders in the Rue Morgue. I argue in this that they are dual auteurs. They are very creative, very personal, very expressive, and very skilled filmmakers that express their personal philosophies on life and their personal political attitudes in the late 60s and early 70s in the guise of these 4 Gothic horror films. So read that and you'll enjoy it and you'll be smart.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. Dr. Haberman, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, if you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we had having it. Once again, I'm Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.